Well, please do keep Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12 to chapter 11, verse 1 open in front of you. Now, it's been a few years since I studied for an exam at this point in my life, which I'm not too sad about, probably because I found revision to be a bit of a chore. I remember for my GCSE science exams, they gave us these textbooks, and they said, everything you need to know is in this book, which is quite a helpful resource. Like, everything we need for the exam is in one place. But I thought in my wisdom at that age that was still a bit too long. So what I did was I looked at the bottom of each page, because in the bottom right-hand corner, there was a little red box, and it said, here's what you need to know. And in theory, in one sentence, summed up everything that was on that double-page spread. So I went through the textbook, and I read every single little red box to get through my exams, because that made it quicker. Now, I don't recommend that technique. I don't endorse that way of revising. But today in our passage, Moses gives Israel a little here's what you need to know box. And all the information you've heard, here is what you need to remember. Here is what you need to know. Here's the key thing to not forget. Moses has been recalling Israel's history to them. He talks about how God rescued them from when they were slaves in Egypt. He's led them to this point despite their constant sin and rebellion. And he's laid before them this call to obey their God. And now in verse 12, Moses starts, here's what you need to know. Here's the key thing to not forget. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good. Moses' call to the Old Testament Israelites and to us today, to God's people, is this: love the Lord. God's people are to remember to love the Lord. Now, in verses 12 to 13, Moses uses 5 different words to call Israel to action, 5 different verbs. He says God asks nothing more of them than to fear the Lord, to walk in obedience, to love him, to serve him, and to observe all his commands. Each of these words gives us a slightly different picture or angle on what it's going to look like for Israel to be faithful as they move into their new home in the Promised Land, what it's going to look like to be faithful. To fear the Lord is not to act out of anxiety, trying to appease someone that they're scared of, but it's about reverence and respect, knowing God is a very big God and not wanting to let him down. To walk in obedience is to carry on doing life the way God has directed. To serve is to put God first, perhaps giving up their own preferences for what God has commanded. To observe the Lord's commands is to obey the rules and decrees that Israel have been given by God through Moses. Yet despite all these different angles, all these different words, Israel are called to one way of life, one verb in the middle of the 5, love. What does the Lord your God ask of you? To love the Lord, to be devoted in their hearts to him and none before him. Jesus tells us in John chapter 14 that this is what love looks like when he says to his disciples, if you love me, keep my commands. For God's people, to love God will look like obedience. It will look like serving him, walking in his ways. What does God ask of you, Israel? To love the Lord. Now, some of the films that Evie's introduced me to since we've been together, I seem to forget that I've watched. So Evie will tell me that we've seen this film before. We'll put it on TV. We'll meet the main characters. I don't think I've ever seen this before. This story is completely foreign to me. Until halfway through, something happens, and I go, yes, I definitely have seen this before. And I promptly and proudly tell Evie, we have watched this before. And she goes, yes, I told you that. Now, the Israelites who were listening to Moses attentively might have been thinking at this moment, I've seen this before. I've heard this bit before. And they would be right. Earlier on in chapter 6, Moses has made a very similar point to Israel. He says to them in chapter 6, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Fear the Lord your God and serve him only. Again, Moses lays the call before Israel. What does it look like for them to be God's people, to love God? Here is what God requires of you, to love the Lord. So why the repetition? Has Moses just got forgetful in his old age? Has he forgotten what he's been saying? No, Moses repeats himself because people forget what it is to love. Israel, God's people, are forgetful lovers. God's people are forgetful lovers, and Moses has been reminding them of that fact. He's reminded them of how even though they were miraculously rescued from Egypt, taken away from slavery, freed from their chains, they still crafted and worshipped a golden cow. They still needed a second set of 10 commandments. Israel are forgetful lovers. They forget what it is to love God. In my pride, I can very easily assume that I would never, ever make the same mistake someone else has made, especially perhaps when driving. Maybe going down the motorway, you see someone without their lights on, and you think, I'd never make that mistake. Or they're at a roundabout, and they're trying to move 2 lanes to the right at the end of the roundabout. You think, I'd never make that mistake. I'd never be so foolish. Only to find the next roundabout, I'm 2 lanes too far to the left, and I need to make the same maneuver. We can think in our pride, I'd never make the same mistake. And we can look at Israel and say, how could you possibly make that mistake? How could you forget what it is to love God, to say it with your lips, but not to do it? Yet Moses' warning and words are accurate of us today too. God's people, us, are still forgetful lovers. We are those who, like the Israelites, have been rescued by God miraculously, saved by Jesus when we were lost in sin without a way to rescue ourselves, yet we are also forgetful lovers. We forget what it is to love God. We so easily turn loving God from humble service to just knowledge, to saying with our lips we love God, yet quietly worshipping idols, being quite content and not being fully devoted in some areas, being quite content to hold on to some respectable idols like greed or pride or work or family. We are forgetful lovers. We forget what it looks like to truly love the one who has rescued us, to be wholly devoted to our God. What does the Lord ask of you, Israel? Nothing more than to love the Lord. But this is no small task. To fear the Lord, to walk in obedience to him, to serve him, to obey him is not easy. And it's especially difficult for forgetful lovers like me and you. It's a big request, and at this point, Israel might be thinking, this is quite unreasonable. I'm sure some of you will know what I'm referencing, some of you won't, but in the second Star Wars film, there's a scene where the heroes have been captured, and they're basically put in a big gladiator arena to be got rid of. Except, of course, the heroes free themselves, and they start to fight back, and they ruin the villain's plans. And one of the villains watching on shouts out and points, she can't do that. She can't free herself. It's unreasonable. The hero is ruining the villain's plans. And we might be thinking on hearing God's call to love him with our whole heart, to be wholly devoted to him, we might be thinking that's unreasonable. We might be thinking, God can't do that. That's going to ruin some of my plans. This is a big call, but it comes from a big God who has shown big mercy. Moses is going to show Israel that this big call has come from a big God who shows big mercy, and he's going to show them specifically how this love is to be lived out by loving the downcast. What does the Lord require of you to love the Lord by loving the downcast? In verse 14, Moses starts to give us a picture of how grand their God is. He says, to the Lord your God belongs the heavens, even the highest heavens, and the earth and everything in it. God's reign knows no bounds. There isn't an area of the highest heavens or anywhere on earth he does not rule. There is not a cell, a bacteria, an animal, a person, a country, a kingdom, an empire, a star, or a planet that God does not rule over. All belongs to him. Yet verse 15, the Lord set his affection on your ancestors and chose you, their descendants, above all nations. Despite all of creation belonging to God, it is Israel, this small, consistently forgetful lovers, that God has set his affection on. Despite his greatness, he has set his affection on the least and the lowest, rescuing them from when they were slaves in Egypt. This is a big God who has shown big mercy. So Moses calls Israel in verse 16, "Therefore circumcise your hearts. Do not be stiff-necked any longer." Or in other words, turn yourselves around, devote yourselves again to God. Circumcision was a sign given by God to Israel to show the world that they were devoted to God, that they were God's people. They were set aside for him. On the 8th day after being born, the male's foreskin would be removed, showing that this person is part of God's covenant people. This is one who is set apart, devoted to God. But Moses calls for what this sign of circumcision represents. He calls for a circumcision of the heart, a devotion of the heart to God. He says to Israel, don't be stiff-necked any longer. Don't be slow to turn around to come and love your God, but devote yourself to him, for he has set his affection on you. A few weeks ago, maybe months ago now, I managed to injure the right side of my neck. It's a fairly commonplace injury I have, happens every year or so. And if you see me when I've injured it, I'm basically lopsided. This shoulder goes all the way up to my ear, and I look a bit strange. And turning around becomes a real chore, especially when driving and you go to look out your window on the side. Your whole body has to move around. It's not a simple job anymore. It's a bit of a slow process. Israel are to be the opposite of this. They are not to be stiff-necked. They are to be quick to turn, to devote their hearts again to God. What does the Lord ask of you? To love the Lord. It's a big call, but it's come from a big God who has shown big mercy. So Moses has given us this pattern of God is great, yet he is merciful, so this is how you are to respond. And now we get a second cycle. Moses is going to show us again that God is great, yet merciful, so this is how you are to respond. And he's going to show us what it looks like for Israel to actually circumcise their hearts. What's it going to look like for Israel to devote their hearts to God? Moses says in verse 17, "The Lord is God of gods and Lord of lords, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes." God is not just ruler over all things, but he is also just. He is not a God who can be bought off or paid out to do some injustice. No, he is supremely just, and because of that, in verse 18, he defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and the foreigner. Despite his greatness, God in his justice cares for the fatherless, the widow, and the foreigner. Now, at different points in the Old Testament, we meet this trio of people, the fatherless, the widow, and the foreigner. And they're put together because they are perhaps the most downcast and vulnerable in Israel. The fatherless and the widow had lost the male who was the head of the household. So not only was there great pain, but there was also now no one to lead their family, no one to grow the food, no one to keep the family safe, to represent them. Or the foreigner, or the refugee, one who had moved from outside Israel, had joined God's people, but isn't genetically linked to them, like the fatherless and the widow, are vulnerable. They have left family behind, they have lost, and now they have perhaps no one to fight their case. If anyone in Israel was to be exploited or hurt, these three people would be first. If Israel failed to love the Lord, then the fatherless, the widow, and the foreigner will always be hurt first. But God is a God who will not let injustice go. So through Moses, he charges Israel in verse 19, "You are to love those who are foreigners. You are to love those who are vulnerable and who are helpless." It's a big call from a big God who has shown big mercy. Israel are to love the Lord by specifically loving the downcast. What does it look like for God's people to circumcise their hearts? It looks like loving the downcast and the vulnerable. the widow, the fatherless, and the foreigner. Later in Deuteronomy, we find that God gave Israel specific rules and laws to follow which would help protect these people. In chapter 24, we read, "When you're harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back and get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow." Israel had these specific rules to follow, which, if they loved God and therefore kept, then these people would be protected. The downcast and the vulnerable would be loved. And this call to care for the downcast and the vulnerable carries on into the New Testament. Paul charges Timothy in his letter, "You are to look after the widows." God's people, just as Israel did, have a responsibility today to care for the most vulnerable and downcast among us. What does God require of you? To love the Lord by loving the downcast and the vulnerable. But who are the widows, the foreigners, the fatherless today? Who might be the vulnerable and the downcast that we are called to love? Well, firstly, it is still the widows, the fatherless, the refugees, those who have lost or have had to leave behind. But it's more than that. It's those who are vulnerable. It's perhaps the very young or the very old, those with learning disabilities, those who are mentally ill, those who are physically ill long term, those with addictions, those who have faced serious abuse in the past. It is those who are downcast and vulnerable, who at times may not be able to help themselves, that God has called his people to love. For God, an integral part of us being devoted to him is to love the downcast and the vulnerable. That might look like a committed love. Going to someone who is housebound to listen to them, to go and fix a tap in their house, to take someone round a meal when they can't face cooking that day. It might be a committed love. It might be a patient love. Listening to and praying for the same person week after week, day after day, who struggles with the same problems and who doesn't seem to move on or get better like we hope. It might be a committed love, a patient love, or it might simply be a welcoming love, giving a warm welcome to those with messy lives who the world tends to overlook because it's awkward and difficult to get involved. We are called to care for the vulnerable and the downcast with a patient, committed, welcoming love, because this is how we have been loved already. What does the Lord require of you? To love the Lord by loving the downcast, just as you have been loved. Harriet Tubman was a lady born into slavery in North America in the 1800s. Later in her life, she managed to escape where she was being held a slave, but she went back home to free her family. And she did so 13 times over her life to set 70 people free. Harriet dedicated her life to helping people experience the same freedom she knew. She wanted others to know the same freedom that she had experienced. And in a similar way, we are called to show the same love that we know from Christ. We are called to love the downcast and the vulnerable, for this is how we have been loved. Moses says to Israel in verse 19, "And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt." Moses takes them back to their days when they were the downcast, when they were the vulnerable, when Israel were the helpless. Yet it was from this place God rescued them. In verse 21, "He is the one you praise. He is your God who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your own eyes." God set his affection on the downcast and the vulnerable. And the glorious truth is that in Christ he has done the same for us. We were not in slavery to Egypt in physical chains, but in something much worse. We were stuck in slavery to sin, unable to get rid of it from our lives, unable to do things that would please God. We were those who were helpless, no way to help ourselves, those without hope, yet God in his mercy set his love on us. Before time began, he chose us of all people to be his. We who are consistently forgetful lovers, God chose to be his, and he sent Christ to rescue the helpless. Not with the awesome deeds we read of that happened in Egypt, but with something much greater. With the awesome deeds of the cross and the empty tomb, as the Son of God hangs in our place to defeat sin once and for all, and rose again to crush death, giving freedom to the helpless and hope to the hopeless. We were those who were downcast and vulnerable, yet Christ in his love set his affection on us. Therefore, this is how we are to love, with the same love we have received. A patient, committed, welcoming love. What does God ask of you? To love the Lord by loving the downcast, just as you have been loved. As we finish, there may be some of us here today who feel very much in that category of the fatherless and the widow and the foreigner. Perhaps we feel vulnerable, perhaps we feel downcast, perhaps we feel slightly helpless. And if you feel in that category today, can I point you to our God again? Our God, who although he is God of God and Lord of lords, defends the cause of the widow and the fatherless, who cares for the vulnerable and the helpless. Now that's a big claim to make. And when we make big claims, we want proof. When I used to work as an outdoor instructor, I taught people how to go climbing. If they were nervous that they were going to fall and go splat on the ground, a way to help their nerves was to show them how the equipment worked, to show them the proof that actually I could keep them safe, to show them they weren't going to hit the ground or get hurt. It was the proof that they would be kept safe, that it wouldn't fail. We might ask, where is the proof that God means what he says? Where is the proof that he upholds the cause of the fatherless and the widow? Well, we see the proof most fully in Jesus as God walks the earth. You don't need to turn there, but in Luke 7 we read this short account of when Jesus meets a widow. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Do not cry." Then he went up and touched the bier they were carrying him on, and the bearer stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. When Jesus saw this woman without hope, when he saw the downcast, the vulnerable, someone who was a widow who had lost her child, his heart went out to her. He did not pass by, but he was moved with compassion. Here is one who cares so much that he would become helpless as he hung on a cross to die, bearing its scorn and shame, so that one day he can welcome us home to a world where there is no longer anyone who is vulnerable, where we are finally safe, where the worry, the death, the exploitation, the addiction of this world will be gone forever. The cross is the ultimate proof that God cares for the helpless and the vulnerable as he dies so one day he can bring them home. Here is one who cares. Here is one we can trust. What does God ask of you? To love the Lord by loving the downcast just as you have been loved in Christ. Amen.